Okay, today we are in Romans 14, as we have been for about the last 3 or 4 weeks. But so far we haven't gotten at a text, and so today we're going to get in the text. Now we've been talking about a lot of things, introductory material to prepare us for this. And again, just very briefly today, I want to call your attention that chapter 14 deals with what did the New Testament church do when brethren differ over their human opinions. We need to understand that no two people agree on everything. No two people in the entire world has the same opinions on everything. If we looked really at two elders, and we'd have that as an illustration, and we see there how do they get along? How do Steve and I get along? Is it because we have exactly the same opinion on everything? Now we need to keep in mind that when it comes to a thus saith the Lord, we must be in agreement. But when it comes to an opinion of what we do as far as opinions are concerned, then there is going to be a disagreement. And that's true of every human beings on the face of this earth. Now, how do we work it out without having any problem? How do we work it out without having any hard feelings? Now, here is the suggestion that I have made to Steve. I said, Steve, why don't you just let me make all of the decisions and you agree with them? In other words, now we'd have unity then, so there wouldn't be any problem whatsoever. And you would say, well, Lowell, what is the purpose of having two elders then? Because really, you have to go to the Bible to see what the Bible says, but when it comes to opinion, then my opinion is the only one that counts. I'll get mad if Steve doesn't go along with my opinion. Then really we're violating everything. And of course, if that happened, how would Steve's feelings be toward me? Well, we all understand what that would be. It'd just be a horrible thing. So that's one of the qualifications in Titus 1:7 of elders, and that is not self-willed. You can't be, because you're going to have to know how to get along in the realm of opinions in there. Now, we've already seen here, this right here, I wish I could knock this off. Well, I can't. I changed real quickly but this morning. But let's do it this way. Marriage, I think, is the epitome of this. That we have seen that when two people get married, they're going to take a vow to live together for the rest of their life. Now, it really is not the big thing that causes all of the divorces in the world. That is, the big things are pretty simple. Paul said, tells husbands how to treat their wives, how wives are to live with their husbands. We're to be faithful one with the other, and those are the big things. But yet, 50% of the marriages end up in a divorce. And why is it? Well, it's over the opinion things. How are we going to do this? Who's going to get to spend this money? Who's going to get this and who's going to get that? So we have to learn how to get along with ourselves in that realm. So now then, we learned this last week that we operate in two realms. All people do, all Christians. That is, one realm is over here in God's revealed will. The other is over here in man's opinion. Now, in Isaiah 55, we read it a few times, but here God has made the statement that His thoughts are so far above our thoughts as the heavens are above the earth. Man and God do not think the same way. God's thoughts are so much higher. Now we have God revealing His thoughts, His will in the Bible. And over here we have man's thoughts, man's private opinions. Now we all operate within those two realms. So now, how do we do this? Well, one thing that we would understand, and that is that when God says something, that becomes binding. God says you're to do this, then we don't have the option of negotiating that or trying to work around that. But when you're dealing with man's opinion, then is when you have your give and take. That's what Romans 14 is talking about. Now, today we're going to introduce ourselves to some new nomenclature right before we get into the chapter right here. I want you to notice here, as we start out in chapter 14, it says, but to him that is weak. Just stop right there. But to him that is weak. Who is the weak one? And then the next verse down there, it talks about the strong one. So now there's the weak person and there's the strong person. Now, just like a little while ago, I talked about two elders. And we talk about two elders, we can name them. We can name them, Steve and Lowell. We talk about husband and wife. We can name them. There's Nancy and there's Oliver. So we understand who they are, husband and wife. Now then, we're going to be talking about weak and strong. Well, who are the weak and the strong? We need to identify them before we can go ahead and understand what this chapter is talking about here. Now, if it started out and it says, now, to the husbands, I say, and to the wives, I say, we'd understand. But it doesn't. It says, to the weak and to the strong. So now, before we start reading this, let's identify who is the weak and the strong. Now, we'd normally jump to a conclusion that the strong are the mature Christians who have lots of knowledge, and the weak are the babes in Christ. That would be the normal thing that you would think. But that's not the way it is in this chapter. Now, in other places, of course, it's that way, but that's not the way it is in this particular chapter. So who is the weak and who is the strong then? So we look at this then in here. All right? First of all, think of this. If the strong refers to those who are doctrinally correct, then nobody would ever refer to themselves as weak, would they? In other words, if Marcus and I are going to try to work out our problem here, and so I take him over to Romans 14, I say, now look, Marcus, here it says now to the weak, and you're the weak. What's Marcus going to say? He goes, wait a minute, Lowell, no, I'm the strong one and you're the weak one. And we're going to get an argument about who the strong and who the weak is as we start out in this thing. So we need to identify them. Now keep in mind, all the ways of a man are clean in his own eyes. Now it wouldn't make any difference what we're talking about, Marcus and I. Both of us believe we're right. All the ways of man are clean in his own eyes. So I might just be as wrong as I can possibly be, but as we're talking, I'm going to think I'm right. And I don't want Marcus to call me weak. That's there. Well, who is the weak and who is the strong? So now, isn't that the way everybody in this audience feels? That, yeah, you say, well, I'm not doing anything that I feel is wrong. Now, if nobody refers to themselves as weak, then we can't identify ourselves in this chapter. Who the weak and who is the strong. So we say, what saith the Scriptures? In this particular chapter, what does the Bible say? Who are the strong and who are the weak? All right, here's what it says. It's going to show us that when you have these differences, one Christian thinks God has given us the liberty to do something, like eating meats, and the other Christian does not think God has given us that. He doesn't think He's given us that in there, and he doesn't believe we have the liberty to do it. So now this person, one is strong, and the strong one is the one who believes God's given us the liberty. The weak one is the one that believes God hadn't given us the liberty. Now, as we look at this, I want us to remember one thing that is so important in this particular chapter. This doesn't identify which is right and which is wrong. However, Paul tells us later the strong one will be correct. But it doesn't identify. It's not talking about which is right and which is wrong. These terminologies is talking about one who believes that you have the liberty and one that believes that you don't have the liberty. That really is what this thing is talking about here. Now, with this behind us, I want us to turn to Romans 14 now this morning. And as we turn to Romans 14, let's start out and let's look here. But to him that is weak. Now, this is going to be the person who doesn't believe that you can do certain things. Now, the certain thing before we go any farther, is eating meats. He doesn't believe that you can eat meats. Now, keep this in mind, and it's so important for us to keep this in mind, that in our culture, we would look at this person and say, somehow they've lost their mind. They don't know anything about the Bible. They don't know what the Bible teaches. This person is a vegetarian. And it said, now this person is a weak person. But I want you to see this weak person has a good argument on his side. That's the point that I want to make. Now, what is the argument? Why would this weak person think you shouldn't eat meat? Now, the reason I know this is because Paul deals with it in other places, especially in 1 Corinthians letters in chapter 8 and again in chapter 10. Here's his thinking. In those days, at that time, they didn't have an Albertsons, they didn't have a Safeway, they had what was called a marketplace. Now, a marketplace was in every town, and it would be something like Park Place or Pike Market downtown, just an open market. It'd be kind of like our farmers market that we have on certain days here in Monroe and other cities. So each person brings out their own stuff and they sell it. All right, what would happen back in those days was there was only one church. No denominations whatsoever, one church. And so that wasn't a controversy. Everybody was either a Christian or you were a Jew, which meant you weren't a Christian, you didn't believe in Christ, or you were a heathen and an idolater. There were three groups of people. Now, think today about how that would change things. Because today as you look out, you see all of these denominational churches. And every one of us, as we drove in today, passed some kind of a denominational church, all of them different. Now, they didn't have that in those days. But what they did have would be idols temples. So think, in every place you see a denominational church today, in that day, in Paul's day, you would have seen an idol's temple. One worshiping Zeus, another worshiping Hermes, and so forth and so on. And all of these different idolaters, all these different temples, would have been offering sacrifices to their God on their particular day. Some on Monday, some on Tuesday, some on Wednesday. But they would meet and they would offer a sacrifice. So just stop to think now that up here next to the hospital, this idol's temple was offering a steer, let's say today. So they're offering a steer, and they then are going to eat, and they're worshiping God Zeus. They're worshiping him. Now we all know that's horrible, that's terrible, that's not right. But now when they get through with that, they have meat left over. So what they will do then tomorrow is some of the people will take that down to farmers market. Right? They'll take it downtown, they'll hang it up, and you go down to buy some meat. So tomorrow night you want to have a barbecue. Now you can't go to Safeway. You've got to go to some of these markets. And so here's the beef that's hanging up. Now some people will have a beef hanging that they killed on their own farm and it's not been offered to an idol. But most of the time, when you see it hung up, you'll know somewhere it was offered to Zeus or Hermes or some other god. And so there it is. Now, the question is, can you go to town and buy meat and barbecue tomorrow night? See? Because if you do, you go to town, you buy meat, and you barbecue tomorrow night, the chances are really good that you're going to buy some meat that was offered to an idol today. And so the one set of Christians says, you can't do that. You need to stay away from idolatry just as far as you can stay away from it. And so what you need to do to make sure is don't eat any meat. That's the only way you can be sure, is not to eat any meat. Now that's what one side said. And that's a pretty sensible argument, isn't it? I mean, we're going to stay away from it as far as we possibly can. Now the other side says, no, wait just a minute. No, I can go to town and I can buy that meat and I can eat it. Because even though it was offered to Zeus up here yesterday, I know as a Christian, there is no God Zeus. When they were offering that to their God, there is no God up there. There's only one God, and they were down there and they were offering it to nothing. And so it's not polluted. The meat nothing's happened to the meat. It's not holy meat to God because there is no God Zeus. So I can go buy my meat anywhere I want to and eat it. Now, Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians is this. You may do that. You go to town, buy your meat, bring it home, and eat it. And don't ask any questions. Because, he says, there is no God, Zeus. We know that. So nothing happened to that. Nothing happened to that meat whatsoever that's there. Now, he also says, now here's another thing. He said, if your neighbor invites you over for a meal, can you go? Now, Paul deals with this in 1 Corinthians. Now, the chances are, if they offer meat, it's been offered to an idol. And it may be that they are an idolater and they think they're serving you holy meat. So, can you ever go eat with your neighbor? Because you're probably going to get in that circumstance. So Paul said, if your neighbor invites you, go. Don't ask any questions. Go. If they put a steak in front of you, eat it. No problem. Because nothing's happened. He said, but if that person looks up at you and says, now this hath been offered to the god Zeus. In other words, to let you know that they are giving you sanctified, holy meat that's been offered to the god Zeus. He said, don't eat it. Push your steak back. Don't eat it. Not because the meat's polluted, but he said because of the other person's conscience. If you go ahead and you eat it, that other person will believe that you believe in the god Zeus. And you've left the wrong impression. So even though you can eat it, it's legal, it's lawful in the eyes of God, now you can't eat it because you're leaving the wrong impression on that other person. This was a big problem in their day. So stop to think, really, how big it was. If every time you eat meat, a hamburger, you go to a hamburger place, you bring a hamburger home or steak, every time you put a piece of meat in your mouth, this is a major issue. How big a problem, you see, would it be in the church? That's the way it was back there. So now, Paul says here, he said, now, him that is weak in the faith receive ye, yet not for decisions of scruples. Now, I'm going to stop right here because this is an interesting verse. First of all, he that is weak in the faith. So let's establish something. What does it mean, he that is weak in the faith? All right, it's the person who doesn't have the knowledge of the full gospel of Christ. They're weak in the faith. Now, the faith, as you look at it right here, is just the gospel. The best way to show that is in Galatians 1:22. There Paul is talking and he says, but they only heard say that he that once persecuted us now preacheth the faith. So he said, now these people out here had heard that Paul, who used to persecute them, was now preaching the faith. Now, what was Paul preaching? The faith. Now, in the same chapter, by the way, in Galatians 1, he goes ahead and he says that he's preaching the gospel. So he's preaching the gospel, and he said, I'm preaching the faith. The faith and the gospel, meaning exactly the same thing. Jude said, I was constrained to write unto you, exhorting you to contend earnestly for the faith which was once for all delivered unto the saints. Now, what was it that was one time for all times delivered unto the saints? It was the faith. It was the gospel. The gospel is called the faith because the gospel tells you what you are to believe. And whatever you believe, whatever your faith is, you get it from the gospel. And so that is a terminology that's used, the faith and the gospel being synonyms then. Okay, now then, we have the faith meaning the gospel, the Bible. And so down here we got Romans 10:17. So faith cometh of hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. That's the only way that you can get it. Now what are we going to put in this person's mind? See, we're going to take that faith up there, that word, that gospel, and put it in this person's mind down here. Now, think about this, that if we were all perfect, all of us are perfect, we know everything about the gospel we need to know, we understand it all, see, in every way, then we wouldn't have any problem with Romans, the 14th chapter. But now, we're not quite all perfect yet. And so, until we all come to the perfection, what are we going to do with our differences? That's what Romans 14 is about. What are we going to do with those differences in there? To illustrate it like this. So here we have the faith of the Bible. I have my faith right here. Now, since we're not all perfect, then, what are we going to do? Look in Ephesians 4:13. He said that we're to grow and keep growing. And how long are we to grow? We're to grow until we all come to the unity of the faith. That's oneness. We're to keep growing until we all understand exactly the one thing the Bible teaches, so that we all comprehend that. Come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God. That is, our knowledge is complete. To a perfect man. So we're to keep growing until we're all perfect, until we're all mature. Well, when will that be? It says, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Until I can come to the point that I say I understand everything that there is to understand in the Scriptures. I know it completely and I know it fully. And I have grown until I am exactly like Christ. I can't get any better. So don't grow past that, see. But Paul says we're to grow until we come to that point, which none of us are going to achieve, but we're to grow until we come to that point. Now, what are we going to do, though, until we come to that point? You see, if we were all exactly like Christ, we'd never have any problem with any of these opinion things. We'd never have any doctrinal problems. But we're not there. We're not there. We all have this thing like this meat in here that we've got. So what are we going to do then? I want you to note these verses. We're not going to look at them there, but just notice. When it talks about the faith of man, my faith, Bible talks about little faith, great faith. The apostle said, increase our faith. Your faith grows, Paul said. Some people have a dead faith, and some people have a mature or perfect faith. We all have different degrees of faith that's in here. Now, here's another big thing to understand, especially when we get down to the last verse in here. When you read about faith, your faith now, in Romans 14, it's talking about the faith that we possess to whatever extent that is. Now, once he starts out up here in verse 1, he says in here talking about the faith, that's the gospel. Now then, from here on, the faith is talking about the faith that I have. So that's where we're going to be dealing with what does man think in this particular realm here. Okay, so we start out. But to him that is weak in the faith, receive you. So first of all, if there's somebody who is weak in the faith, somebody comes in and they're like this guy that believes that you can't eat meat. They're weak in the faith. What do? You kick them out and say, look, fella, we don't want you in here because you're going to be causing some problems and so forth. No, him that is weak in the faith, receive ye, yet not for decision of scruples, my translation says. Now that doesn't make sense. When you read that, you say, what does that mean? Let's look at some other translations, and it will make sense. What really does that mean? All right, New King James said, receive one who is weak in the faith, but not to dispute over doubtful things. Don't receive him so you can argue with him about things that there's some doubt about, some of these questionable things. So don't get involved in that and become an expert in arguing about these things that fall in the realm of these human opinions. Now, the New American Standard, now accept the one who is weak in the faith, but not for the purposes of passing judgment on his opinions. So don't hit him in and then say, now, we're getting you in here, now here's what it is, and so here's your purpose in life. There are some argumentative people in the church, and they like to argue, and they like to argue about these things that here. What does the Bible mean about this? Well, I think about this. All right, he said, receive them so you can get in those kind of arguments. Him that is weak in the faith, receive ye, but not to doubtful disputations. So not to argue over these things that there's all this doubt that is about here. As for the man who is weak in the faith, welcome him, but not for disputes over opinions. Right? So all these translators trying to show us this is the thing that we're talking about. Accept him whose faith is weak without passing judgment or on disputable matters. Now right here's the great translation. As you can see down there, LDW, that's mine. And the way I would translate that, and what it just literally says is, now the one being weak in the faith you receive, not for the purposes of judgments of thoughts or reasonings. That literally is what it's saying. So not for that particular purpose. So now receive him. All right, what are we going to do then? Now then, what are we going to do? That one person says you can't eat meat, and they're honest, and I can see they have a good idea. And if you eat that meat was offered yesterday to that despicable idol, and I'm going to stay away from it. That's the intentions are good, and they're honest. And now then, so that's what we're going to do. So now what do we do? What do we do now about this thing? Well, I just put this up here. This is the New King James Version of what we're dealing with. And the reason I put it up is because I've been reading here from the American Standard. But let's look here so that we can maybe get through here these first 4 verses. All right, verse 2. For one believes he may eat all things. Now the reason we believe that is because the Lord said all things are pure. You can eat anything. But he who is weak eats only vegetables. Now, this identifies the weak. The weak one is the one that says you can't do it. Here's another thing to really think about. Here's this weak person that says, no, you can't do it. I'm not going to get involved with idolatry at all. We need to stay away from it. Now, would he consider himself weak? See? No, he would say, I'm the strong one because I'll make these sacrifices. I'll stay away from it. But Paul says, no, we're identifying it. Now, the strong one is the one that knows you can eat all things. But the weak one is the one who really believes that he's strong and, yes, I can do this and so forth. So that's the weak one that's there. Okay. He said now in verse 3, now let not him who eats despise him who does not eat. And let not him who does not eat judge, and that word means condemn, him who eats. For God hath received him. Now, when we're in the realm of these opinions, we cannot make it a binding situation so that we're going to condemn people to hell because they don't go along with my thoughts on this particular matter. I firmly believe I can eat meat because the Lord made all things clean. This guy said, yeah, but that's not talking about idolatry. I agree that all meats are clean, but this beef has been offered to Zeus, and I think we need to stay as far away from idolatry as we can. Well, I do too. I think we need to stay away from it as far as we can, but I don't think that's getting close. I don't think that's it. Unless somebody thinks that I'm doing it, my influence, there's going to be a big thing, influence, so in there, but unless my influence is this way, so I can go ahead and eat it. So what are we going to do? He said, now when you come down to this realm, both of you are to receive the other person. You're to accept the fact, okay, you're a faithful Christian, and I'm a faithful one, even though we have these points of disagreement as far as our opinion is concerned. Because God has received both. That's what Paul says. He said, who are you to judge another's servants? Now, if God has received this person who believes this, he's a child of God, who am I to come along who is another child, another servant, and I'm going to become the judge of God's servant? And when you put it that way, it sounds awfully ugly. And so if I then made myself the judge today and said, I now stand in a position where I can be the judge, and on any dispute of opinions, you bring them to me, and I'll tell you which is right and which is wrong, and we'll condemn the wrong one, and the wrong one we're going to kick out. What would you say? You'd say, wow, boy, who do you think you are? And you would be true. But we do that on a private basis, on an individual basis. You see, I'll kick this person out, or they'll kick me out on a one-to-one basis. And Paul said, just keep in mind, we are all servants. And then he says, to his own master he stands or falls. Indeed, he will be made to stand, for God is able to make him stand. So leave it up to God, and God will make him stand. Now, one way God can make you stand is this. How many of you have ever, when you became a Christian, you, in your opinion, thought something was wrong and you would not do it? And over the years, you learned differently, and you said, well, I was wrong, I can do that. Has that happened to anybody in here? Well, I could look out, and if you don't raise your hand, I know you're either so ignorant that you've never studied the Bible at all, or you're lying, one of the two. It happens to all of us. And God can make us stand. He can make us grow. He can make us mature. He can make us so that we can see these things. So we have to say, okay, how are we going to get along in this particular realm? Okay, there's where we close today.